English translation, 664th Contact Saturday, the 19th of November 2016, 14:57 hours.
Greetings again, Edouard, dear friend.
Likewise, Ptah, my friend. It is simply always a great pleasure to welcome you again, which I will not miss now and say, be warmly welcome.
Thank you, and your eyes say what you have said.
Thank you, dear friend. Unfortunately, very many people on Earth cannot understand what real friendship is.
Which you cultivate, however, also in your community, but which is unfortunately not understood by all. Because you sometimes have to speak a hard word about the truth, which is then interpreted by those as negative aggressiveness, which you have to rebuke or make clear to them what is grossly wrong. In this regard, I must mention in particular because in this case there is no insight whatsoever, as I have had to state again and again for decades. Nevertheless, you keep your friendship with this hitherto unteachable human being on Earth, and do not tire of teaching, which, however, has been falling on barren ground for all decades, since you have been trying to teach this person on Earth. Unfortunately, there is a selfish, stupid, audacious lack of understanding that frightens off all people on Earth, because they don't want to have anything to do with and don't want friendship to arise. This, however, is not noticed by, as a result of stupid, bold self-conceit, which endlessly promotes a pathological delusional attitude in the form of standing above all fellow human beings in every respect, but whereby a state of self-abasement, self-worthlessness, and profound dissatisfaction leads to unpleasant aggressiveness that cannot be kept under control. Basically, such behavior is poor for one's own person and self-destructive, because real joy can never come about and therefore a joyless life is led.
You speak a true word, but people of Earth, who are of this kind and who still think themselves gross and pompous, that they don't care about the opinions of other people, and that they would behave in the way they just do, and how it suits them in their stuff. Such people are actually to be deeply regretted because they can never be happy and content. In all their dissatisfaction with everything and everyone that concerns existence, life, nature and its fauna and flora, the malignant and negative world events and especially their fellow human beings, they do not even know who and what they actually are. In all their dissatisfaction, therefore, some things, actions, and activities are sought and carried out which, when practiced by man, are judged to be false joy and satisfaction. But the truth is that in reality they are only completely false and abstruse self-reflection, self-affirmation, self-pollination, self-pollination or self-exaltation or delusions of grandeur, stupid and primitive self-determination, self-activation and self-deception as well as self-adulation and self-denomination. Such a person is incapable of perceiving the effective reality of his self and of building a true humanity within himself. So it is also impossible for him to recognize that he must personally consciously make a profound and honest effort to enable other people to develop and have a good opinion about him. Through this and other self-processes, it would be possible for such a person to build up a true inner satisfaction within himself and to express it externally. This, instead of vegging out in the stupidly audacious delusion of imagination and thinking that those fellow human beings with whom he is giving himself away, and whom he is suggestively overrunning in his delusion with ranting words, are satisfied with him. In his self-raising delusion, such a person tries to convince others of what he is preaching to them. And in his delusion he also believes that his fellow human beings would listen to him with interest and think completely well of him, because he imagines a contentment in his self-singing. This conceited self-singing, I think, can very well be described by terms such as affectation, presumption, arrogance, blasphemy, conceit, vanity, puffiness, salience, fussiness, affectation, condescension, hopefulness, and hubris, whereby this term also means exuberance, as well as an extreme form of overestimation of oneself and a certain arrogance. But it must also be said that this may also be associated with a loss of reality, as well as an overestimation of one's own abilities, competences, and achievements. which is why people of this kind behave in an outstanding manner and express themselves with work potentials which they are not entitled to, or which are excessively exaggerated. Although such people also tend to direct others powerfully with instructions when they are dealing with their fellow human beings in relation to their work, etc., above or in any official, deaf, family, group, or community, military, religious, sectarian, or governmental position of power.
You were a very good psychology student of my father's, that's undeniable. I could not have explained your explanation better, which I must admit without envy. But I have to say that during your time you never missed learning.
Thank you, but there's a thought going through my head because I was watching something on a TV channel today about the Cuban crisis in the 1950s and 1960s. Now it is already the 19th of November, and according to your prediction in 1990, Fidel Castro should pass away. But that didn't happen. Is it possible that you were wrong about the month and year?
My prognosis at that time clearly showed that Castro will die this month, but this will not be the case until next Friday, 25th of November, at around 22:30. But as always, you have to keep quiet about it.
Thanks. So it was unwise of me because November is not over yet. But also thank you for your previous good opinion regarding learning. But I have to say that I have learned a lot from you since our contacts from 1975 onwards. But there are no contact reports, because my instructive contacts and the associated conversations were not recorded. So there were still many others, about 1,000 personal conversations, and probably also about 1,300 telepathic conversations with your daughter, Sim Ya Se, with Quetzal and you as well as with others took place, but which were not retrieved and therefore also not recorded. All those who brought your father Svath and I together are excluded from these conversations since 1975, which is why I do not know how many there were during the 11 years during which your father had me under his wing.
I can tell you that because we all have the conversation records. Personal and telepathic conversations were on the one hand extremely intensive and very instructive, whereby during the 11 years 816 personal and 704 telepathic conversations were conducted between you and my father. During 172 days in 1948, the conversations and courses took place daily for 16 hours, also during your obligatory day school time, which you could not attend on the 172 days. Even at night, when your parents and brothers and sisters were asleep, you were taken away by my father and further educated to bring you home in the early hours of the morning before your parents woke up.
Yeah, but why are you talking about this now? I thought Svath told me not to talk about it.
That's probably true, but the duty of confidentiality was only given until you left school. And if you can once tell me something about your time of contracting, how and what you have experienced, then I have to tell you that it is a need for me to experience something of myself. My father may have left records of this, just as of course all your conversations were recorded, but I am interested in what you have to say concerning your reigning time experience.
But I have remained silent about the school absences until today, and when I said something, then I only said that I skipped school in the 4th class with Hans Frey for 172 days without excuse, which is why I had to work up the 4th class with Gustav Lehmann again and also complete the 5th and 6th classes with him. From the 7th grade I was then with teacher Heinrich Fair. What happened afterwards, when I left the 7th grade and went to Sarnen, started the official terror, where the so-called aid organization called Pro Juventute had their hands in the game, together with Mrs. Horat, who constantly viciously insulted me, but I did not know why. One day she ran after me with a wet towel and slapped it in my face, which of course I didn't put up with. So I tore the towel out of her hands and struck it back, also in her face, after which I dropped the towel and ran away. That was the real origin, that the woman ran to the youth welfare office and to the Pro Juventute and sued me. After which I was taken away by the police at home and brought to Albisbrunn and then pushed around from one place to the next as a verting bub, because I was always torn out again and again and did not let myself be terrorized. So it came that I was brought to Albisbrunn and finished the other schools as Verdingbub in different places. As I learned from Svath, the Bulak authorities received a salary from the respective people, for whom I had to work hard as a hired out. In Sarnen, I was in a dairy/cheese dairy border pasture, where I worked hard in the morning before school, and in the evening after school in the cheese dairy, and in the clean operation, and in the early morning hours also with a heavy motorcycle trailer on a bicycle 15 kilometers away, fetched the milk for the dairy, which they let down by cable car from the Alp. In Albisbrunn, I worked in all leisure hours in the toy production, in the Knabenheim Sellnau ZH in the furniture repair workshop, then in the Landheim Brutisellen in the nursery. In Wietikon, my work was in the nursery, vegetable processing for all workforces, as well as locksmithing and general masonry maintenance, etc. In Aarberg again, I was a kitchen assistant. As usual, I made myself out of the dust, like everywhere else. That is to say, I drew the Finkenstrich and went on wanderings until the police caught me again. Finally, when they couldn't stop me in Aarberg, where I climbed down the dangerous Castle Rock and from there walked about 90 kilometers on foot to Monschaltdorf, where I was hired as a farmhand in the early Obwald. For a monthly wage of 15 Swiss francs plus board and lodging, the Bulak authorities suddenly said that they didn't want anything to do with me anymore. And this was because they had had immense expenses of over 25,000 Swiss francs for my runaway at all the different contracting locations, and that they could not make themselves further expenses because of me. After all the Verdingbub episodes, I went above Wald ZH near the village Huebli to work as a farmhand in the so-called Earlyhof, where I learned the forestry trade and also the necessary handling of horses in relation to wood hauling. In addition, I had to take care of the cows, cattle, pigs and horses in cooperation with an old and somewhat rickety servant, but also the sawmill trade on a simple water-powered sawmill on which I had to balance tree trunks, clamp them, and saw them into boards after some time. Unfortunately, the farmer's wife was stingy, so there was not enough food for me and the old farmhand, which is why we satisfied our hunger by filling our stomach with pig feed flakes in the animal feed store. Fortunately, however, your father Svath was always worried about me and my learning. So he got me out of bed during the nights and taught me in his pear-shaped beamship so that I wouldn't suffer any learning losses, which was the case when I skipped school 172 times. To the contrary, I want to say that I learned much more with Svath than in any compulsory school. Even if teachers Karl Graf in the 1st to 3rd grade and Gustav Lehmann in the 4th and then 6th grade supported me very helpfully. I want that to be clear for once. Well, when one day I left the Earlyhof behind me, I went home to Gutenswil ZH, where my parents had bought an older house after they had sold their house in Monschaltdorf, which they bought after they had sold the house they had built themselves by father. Mother and construction worker in Niederflachs-Bulak, because all of us were terrorized by scurrilous people and received no help from the authorities. So this was the time when I lived at home in Gutenswil. While in Fereltorf, I took a course in bricklaying and plastering in the building construction business, and was paid 95 centimes an hour. Afterwards, I was approached in Fereltorf on the Dorfstrasse by a civil engineering construction manager named Szigeti, of the company Piatti Strassenbau, who saw me working on the construction of a building at the shoe factory Glog. He said that he had been watching me at work for days, and had found that I was an exceptionally good and hard-working worker, what I receive as an hourly wage. Of course I told him, and he asked if I would rather work in another place for more wages and also learn new things. Of course I said yes, whereupon he said that the civil engineering sector would receive better and higher wages, namely a wage of FAR 2.20 for unskilled workers, whether I was interested in this wage. If so, then I could immediately start working on the road construction site in Fereltorf. Of course, I answer yes to that too, not only for the sake of wages alone, but also because I was able to learn something new. The consequence was that he explained two things. Firstly, he himself would initiate my immediate termination and settlement of accounts with Baumeister Müller so that I could start my new job the very next morning. Secondly, he explained that he had seen that I was a very good worker and that I would raise my future salary to FAR. 2.60, which he could justify to the boss Alfredo Piatti. And last but not least, he said that I only had to work for 2 weeks on direct asphalt laying for the road surface, after which I was trained as a machinist for various road construction machines, such as bulldozers, trucks and rollers, heavy compressors for road surface braking, etc., as well as for vibrators and frogs, etc., as well as additionally for cranes and sewer laying, etc. And all of this has then also resulted and fulfilled what ultimately enabled me to form my own civil engineering chord groups on my own initiative and to be independent. My father taught me cobbling, handicrafts, and much more. My mother taught me sewing, crocheting, cooking, baking bread, and knitting. Later, I was also a night watchman and porter, learned how to build fuel oil tanks, and how to clean them on my own in the event of silting up. I also learned the craft of laying slabs, laying reinforcements, sandblasting, building, and ship painting, as well as marble cutting. I was also a tourist guide, typesetter, sales representative, nitroglycerin driver, private detective, etc., and so on. In between my life then, the thing arose, which was set in motion by my brother-in-law, who had gotten involved with 2 criminals and accused me of slanderously bad things which did not belong on my cap. For this I was accused and convicted by a corrupt prosecutor, who was bribed by the father of one of the 2 brothers-in-law friends, who was of course left unchecked because his father was a millionaire several times, with a horrendous sum, as Ascot told me when she investigated the whole thing very closely with regard to the accusation and the trial, because she knew about the effective truth and wanted everything cleared up. But I also survived this nasty tour, which cost me 4 years, and Ascot was a great help to me. And that I also traveled many countries, often on foot, as well as that I worked for certain private individuals, government officials, and for 3 police organizations abroad. You know that as well as that I got to know various heads of state, etc., therefore I do not have to talk about it.
Thank you, my friend. The whole thing was detailed enough for me and shows me various things more clearly than I know them from my father's notes.
But it doesn't really matter what good or bad things have been, because the only thing that has always been important to me is that I have learned something from everything, and have been able to use the valuable things in my life as well as for the good of my fellow human beings and for my work. So I am satisfied with my life, and if I could live it again, then I would not change anything at all, but would live through all the ups and downs again, including all those things, events and situations, etc., that have caused me much misery, distress, and pain. Everything was my lived purpose in life, all the good things that made me happy, while much evil threw me into deep abysses, from which I had to crawl up again laboriously and often with pain and agony. But I have always mastered both forms of experiencing things, events and situations in the end, even if often only laboriously survived, but I have always managed it, because I am never despondent, but always looked forward and told myself that everything can be created and accomplished, if you only tell yourself and are sure that it is really possible. So I was always aware that there must never be any hesitation, no matter what and how it is, because only because of the clear view in relation to looking forward and the effective and unswerving going forward, everything leads to success and to the appointed determination point, which, however, is not simply an end point, but at the same time also a new starting point, which continues and again requires an end point. If it is reached again, becomes again a new starting point, etc., etc. To give up something that one has undertaken to do and achieve in a good framework, that means nothing more and nothing less than a self-abandonment and thus a failure of oneself. In order to avoid this, I learned very early on from Sfath, your father, that important things have to be considered, which I want to do as follows. On the way to success, it must always be the case that important things are never forgotten, that the destination is never lost out of one's senses, and that doubts do not blur. Surrender is not and must never be a solution. Care must also be taken to ensure that strict motivation is always maintained and therefore remains active. However, this must not give rise to any passion, because such a passion can lead to fanaticism, which is extremely detrimental to personal development and sooner or later in some way leads to failure. So also the necessary knowledge must be available, therefore everything necessary must be learned in this regard. This also means that, in order to lead a successful life in the long term and to achieve the set destinations or goals, all tasks, stamina, thoughts and feelings, topics, and a minimum motivation must always be present in order to achieve what is aimed for as a concrete goal. On the way to success, it must not happen that some important aspects and things are forgotten, and the final destination is blurred by fears, allotria, inattentiveness, displeasure, and doubt, etc., and is no longer fully perceived and consequently no longer pursued. So especially in these points, it must not happen that thoughts, feelings, and inclinations arise in such a way that everything that has been positively done suddenly gives up, simply throws in the pimple, or perhaps simply postpones the whole thing of striving to a later point in time. If this is done, then in any case the result will be that wrong decisions will be made, and the set destination or simply the set goal will not be reached. There are certain and plausible reasons for the fact that a positive and valuable destination once set must absolutely be striven for in such a way that it is also achieved with bravura, which I will summarize in the following points. 1. The human being must always know why he is starting something positive, so he must see a clear, positive, and valuable meaning in his whole project. He must remember this meaning and always hold on to it with all his strength when suggestions of thoughts and feelings come to give up the whole thing that has been done. Again and again it must be brought to mind why the whole thing was started at all, and what basic purpose it should serve. It is also necessary to think back to the fact that once there was a time of clear thoughts and feelings in which there was complete certainty for the desired destination of attainment, that this set goal would be implemented and achieved through the process of the entire implementation. So it is also necessary to remember these thoughts and feelings and their intentions, whereby the certainty remains or renews itself again and again. Success is not simply a test, but the achievement of a set goal, which must be achieved, or an accomplished destination, which must be striven for and achieved through all highs and lows. Striving must become the indisputable rule, because only in this way can the whole exist, and man must also be prepared to let himself be guided by what he has set out to do, and to persevere until he achieves what must be the positive end result. 2. When a person strives for something positive and valuable, he must always remember that he can help himself on the one hand, and his fellow human beings on the other hand, and give support in many respects. If man is to succeed, he must not only improve himself, his behavior, his actions, and the execution of his deeds, but also his life. And only when he does so, does he improve his personal environment, especially and first and foremost that which affects his family and those otherwise close to him, as well as the environment in which his friends and acquaintances move. But the external environment is also influenced positively and well by it, because its entire behavior and its good and positive thoughts, feelings and behaviors as well as its actions and deeds penetrate out into the world into many fellow human beings, who in turn are stimulated to good and positive things. So it must be absolutely certain for man that he wishes his family, his friends and acquaintances and his entire environment, all fellow men as well as nature and its fauna and flora only the very best. That is why it is necessary and absolutely inevitable that man works consciously and willingly as well as very hard on himself, in order to give the whole environment, all fellow human beings, nature and its entire fauna and flora, everything they need and deserve in terms of vibration and, if possible, also acting directly. Every human being has to fight for himself first and foremost, and he must therefore also know that this is the only way he can get to know himself and learn to appreciate, support and protect his fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, as well as Earth itself. But he can only do that if he is a real role model for them and for everything that exists. And if man thinks that nobody listens to him, then he must ask himself why, so that through his reflection he can find out and learn that he is committed to false actions, hopes, deeds, and behaviors that alienate him directly from his fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, as well as from life. But this is the moment when man has to awaken from his self-referential and pathological self-deafness and autocracy, and fight for himself. He must fight to prove to all his fellow men the opposite of what he has done and behaved wrongly in everything he has done so far. This means, however, that he must fundamentally change in every respect to the good and positive, in order to be able to stand at the very top of the list with his fellow human beings. So he must consciously and willingly form the greatest motivation to do the right thing, so that he can also prove to his fellow men that he creates the seemingly impossible and lets it become reality, of which his fellow men are of the opinion with regard to him and his actions, deeds, and behaviors that he is a failure, and one who never manages to become a true man, because that is impossible for him. 3. Once a person gives up something good, positive and important, he will never get rid of his failure, so his failure will accompany him all his life, unless he has a good friend who can explain to him what he has to do for his own sake. As a rule, such a person, who fails in the manner mentioned, is not consciously self-hating in him, and from this alone, so to speak, the dissatisfaction itself. In this way, his impaired mind does not allow him to think about himself, his actions, his deeds, his thoughts and feelings, as well as his fundamentally wrong behavior and, as a rule, obscene and vulgar ways of speaking and fluency of speech. As a result of this, and due to a lack of healthy and positive thoughts and feelings, such a person radiates pathological indifference and coldness of feeling, which have a very negative and bad effect on fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora. In addition, he is repulsive to his fellow human beings. Bland, dull, unpleasant, unfriendly, uncouth, unattractive, even disgusting, etc., and makes any possibility of friendship impossible from the outset. Well, another fact is that when a man gives up his dreams, and as a result of which he has fallen underground into flaming pain, as well as into self-hatred, which he vehemently denies but nevertheless suffers greatly from, he will feel the whole of his wrong actions and behavior all his life. He will banish the effective truth about himself from his life, and always grieve in the perception that he has no real friends who stand by him. And all this only because he deceived himself in such a way that he did not use his chance to become a true and self-respecting man, which he could have created if he had not failed shamefully when he had it in his hand to win, when perhaps friends offered him the opportunity to do so. The fact is that when a person ceases to pursue good and positive dreams in life, he is only waiting to live his life right and bad, and then finally to die hoping to be released from the suffering of his existence, especially when he is also struck by the pain that makes his life his torment. This is because he never managed to bring himself, his wrong actions, his wrong deeds, and his wrong behavior under control, and consequently became sniveling, which was intensified by the fact that his fellow men showed no compassion for him because of his moral wickedness or offensiveness. His commonness, his shameful behavior, his indecency, his linguistic corruption, and his immorality. That a human being, as I have just described him, can only bring himself under a healthy and positive self-control and become a true human being through this, can only happen through external help with mind and reason, is tried to teach him and bring him on the right path of life. But this is a very protracted process, which under circumstances can remain an attempt throughout one's whole life, because the stupid, audacious stubbornness and arrogant self-importance of a man who is so disturbed in understanding, reason in psychology hardly allows any or no reaction with regard to a helpful, enlightening, and reasonable conversation, precisely because there is no interest on the part of the man affected by negativity and self-importance to become a fully fledged, honorable, and worthy man. 4. The person who negatively exercises his thoughts, feelings, and behaviors should strive to direct his thoughts and aspirations toward what it would be like if he were successful and had a circle of friends around him who would honor him fully rather than water him. Man should never forget to have a real, good and positive dream for self-control and self-esteem and self-realization in order to be a true, honorable and worthy man who through his healthy thoughts and feelings can also perceive, experience, and understand that he is a true man among his peers in his actions, deeds, and behavior. He must know that he really lives his dream and carries it into the future until his death, which he can face with honor and dignity and say that he has lived his life in a decent, honorable, worthy, and humane way in joy, love, and contentment. 5. Man as such, in his actions as well as in his morals and in his behavior and in his knowledge, should not simply be average, but should strive in every respect to always do everything to the best of his ability. In order to endure throughout life, man must be urged out of himself to do everything possible to give and do the best he can. And he must always do everything to the right to always be at the top of the level of true humanity, and to be great, and not just sometime in the future. So he must never give himself up and not simply take the path of mediocrity, but must constantly make an effort and educate himself in every possible relationship he can think of. As a result, he must also protect himself from the fear and the possibility of simply leading a normal life in a state of indifference, lack of self-control, loyalty to fate, lack of interest and humility, but he must learn to be himself all around with his own needs, interests, dreams, and desires, which he knows how to realize and fulfill through his own energy and strength, as well as through understanding and reason. All I want to say now is that all that I have now said should not be misunderstood, that it must therefore be clear to me that I do not condemn any human being, however he may be by his intellect or ignorance, and by his reason or ignorance. So I also let every human being live his own life and behave as he wants to. But I take the liberty as announcer of my mission to teach people the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, if they are willing to hear or read it. I also take the liberty of drawing people's attention to their wrong actions, deeds, and behaviors through the instructive opinion, and of showing them the way to correct them if there is any circumstance that suggests it. It would not do me any good if I were to act in the wrong way, as it would not do that majority of earthly mankind any good to be accused of wrong actions, deeds, and behavior, because unfortunately it is poor in understanding and unreasonable, and therefore triggers and promotes murder and manslaughter and all evils, as well as wars, the death penalty, and all conceivable crimes. And if all people would cultivate their thoughts, feelings, their actions and their behavior in the way that corresponds to the creational natural laws and recommendations, then vain would be peace and love, joy and harmony on earth, and among all people. And I know with certainty that if mankind is honest with himself and also in a loving and peaceful way with his fellow men, nature and its fauna and flora, then for all evils there is neither a danger nor something of which he should be taught. The fact is that every human being is his own master, and capable of making himself successful in every possible relationship he strives for. Unfortunately, however, there is also the ironic fact that every person can only prevent himself from something and put himself at a disadvantage, so that he then stands in his own way to the future and a better and positively fulfilled life. And it doesn't matter whether he does it on his own wrong initiative, or whether other people do something about it.
What should I say about that, because all your remarks are so correct that further explanations are not needed?
Thanks for your opinion.
Then I would like to continue working with you on the inciting, for which I can still spend some time. Then I have to go.
Good, then let's start with this one.
So that's all you got?
That's all I've got right now. Occam has to send me new material first.
Well, the rest here, that is insignificant. Therefore, the whole thing can be deleted. But now, Edward, I need to go because I still have some work to do.
But if it's not so urgent, I'd have 1 or 2, 3 more questions.
I'm not in that much of a hurry, so I can hear what questions you have left.
Thank you. Then the first question, which relates to what you said on the 6th of November about the fraud which will occur in the USA in direct connection with the presidential election. Do you now know anything new through a foresight?
I can't tell you much about that yet. But so much that Hillary Clinton, in her obsession with power, will also interfere personally in the machinations, because she hopes that she will still be granted the presidential office after all. I have not been able to fathom more into the future because my time was very much limited.
For now, your information will do. Then the next question. As you have known for a long time, there have been more and more unwanted things going on in my computer since some time ago, which emanate from large cult organizations and intelligence services, as you have explained. Zafanat Paniach has also said something about this, namely that the worldwide espionage network Echelon has its dirty fingers in it, which is a worldwide espionage network of the intelligence services of the USA, as well as Australia, Great Britain, Canada, and New Zealand.
That is correct. And through the system of this spy network, fax connections, countless internet data, and telephone conversations are registered, tapped and evaluated by authorities, state offices and authorities, as well as by corporations, companies, the military, and all kinds of business sectors. Certain organizations, groups, and associations are also among those spied upon, such as the FIGU Association, as you know from Zafanat Paniach, who clarified this fact. The system is not only used to listen to conversations and record fax material, etc., because the acquired data is forwarded via satellite to a separate computer center, where the secretly acquired data streams are evaluated fully automatically. The whole system serves not only the data collection, but also the monitoring of certain persons, companies, state and authority officials, military corporations, companies and organizations, but also private persons, associations, and groupings. And what you have mentioned regarding the strange occurrences in your computer, which occur again and again. Since you have been working with it since 2001, that does not come from approximate, because they are deliberate external interventions, the origin and cause of which we unfortunately could not fathom yet. But now Zafanat Paniach, together with his colleague Yanarara, who both...
So that's not supposed to be Frank. Well, what does the name Yanarara mean? Do you know that?
Of course, the name value means the bright one.
Thanks. Then there is this question. Can you please say something about the lousy machinations of the West, especially the EU dictatorship, the USA, and the media, which are inciting war against Russia?
In principle, it can be explained that the entire warmongering of the EU dictatorship, the USA, and the media against Russia has for years brought misfortune upon Earth and its humanity, and is also directly and indirectly to blame for many armed conflicts that flare up again and again worldwide. But what is being done feloniously by inciting war against Russia, be it through lying and false accusations, through sanctions, insults, and slander, etc., is actually more than Russia, that is to say, its government and population, can endure. However, these are contrary to the entire West, so rational that they cannot be provoked, but remain calm and also testify to this through their reasonable behavior and also through their word to the outside world. The Russian government, first of all Putin, as well as the whole population, do not want to bring war or any other calamity on Earth and mankind, but contrary to this, the EU dictatorship and the world power-obsessed USA, as well as the media dependent on these. Through America, the EU dictatorship and the media alone, a tremendous amount of suffering, misery, hardship, death and destruction has spread across the world in the last 25 years. Such as the 2 wars that were unlawful against international law triggered by the USA against Iraq, the invasion, occupation, and dismantling of the state structures. The whole world power-hungry madness of the USA has claimed millions of human victims in the last 25 years alone. And what has been going on in the Orient since the beginning of the new millennium through the fault of the USA has been the basis for the explosive spread of Islamist terror. But even the EU dictatorship has contributed in various ways to the whole disaster, even if this is denied and not made public. The guilt of the USA and the EU dictatorship also includes arms supplies to insurgents and states, as well as military involvement and direct warfare on various non-European fronts. Another guilt of the EU dictatorship that needs to be specifically addressed. however, goes much deeper, namely under the matriarchy of German Chancellor Angela Merkel, to which the autocratic and dictatorial EU dictatorship elements have fallen into servitude. This vengeful and power-obsessed woman can do as she pleases in Germany and in the EU dictatorship without anyone putting a stop to her evil handiwork, and without the EU dictatorship elements realizing that she is acting out as a Holocaust avenger and wants to destroy Germany in particular. This is also the reason why she has created the welcome culture for refugees, which for some time now has led to streams of refugees from the Orient, Africa, and Asia into Europe, which in the view of this woman should on the one hand lead to an over-foreignization and on the other hand cause the security, social, and government system, etc. to collapse. And these well-calculated and malicious machinations have meanwhile progressed so far that the whole thing can hardly be stopped, if at all. As a result, everything that has arisen to date continues to emerge and will continue. Which means that refugee flows, violence, murder and manslaughter, crime, terror, religious, xenophobic, and racial hatred will continue to be washed into Europe. The whole thing is, in principle, a gigantic felony committed against the whole of Europe and its peoples, and committed by a woman who is absolutely incapable of governing, as are the vassals of the EU dictatorship, who are in bondage to her and have fallen in love with her. And the whole thing is a felony that was only possible with the support of the USA, but also with the disinformation, propaganda, and agitation of many Western media. But if everything is looked at closely, then all those evils that can be traced back to the USA and show their dirty machinations began back then, when North America was settled by emigrants from Europe. When European authorities forced sectarian groups, criminals, and felons, other asocial elements and impoverished families, etc., to America. But already in the First World War of 1756 to 1763, the U.S.-American war terror began around the world, which has carried itself into modern times, whereby this U.S. world terror not only still exists today, but is also carried far into the future if a multinational peace fight troop of all earthly states is not finally formed, which prevents the USA from its world domination greed. It must be said, however, that the UN Security Council has also been active on the part of the USA since its inception, and a coalition with fighting for the liberation of Kuwait began on the 16th of January 1991, led by the United States of America and legitimized by UN Security Council Resolution 678. The whole thing happened because Iraq began the violent conquest of Kuwait on the 2nd of August 1990 under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, which was called the First Iraq War or the Second Gulf War. Then, after the attack on the USA on the 11th of September 2001, the American government under President Bush Jr. decided to counter terrorism all over the world with military means. Namely by letting Bush circulate the lie that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, etc., which allegedly represented a danger for the USA. So it was decided that Iraq, which under the dictator Saddam Hussein, was a modern and open country in which the people prospered despite the dictatorship, although here and there in the country itself, as a result of religious hatred. Certain unpleasant and brutal armed conflicts occurred, after Afghanistan would be the second target with war and, as usual, under the false claim that Iraq poses a threat to U.S. security. The open war against Saddam Hussein then began on the 20th of March 2003, after a 90-minute ultimatum by the USA had expired. So at 3:30 in Baghdad, missiles hit a government building where the U.S. Secret Services had suspected Saddam Hussein. And since 2011, the USA has been doing its dirty war business in the Middle East, interfering in Syria, supplying the insurgents with weapons, etc., and fighting the regular troops of the criminal dictator Bashar al-Assad with the Air Force and secret ground troops, which are officially denied by the USA. The truthful Criminal machinations with regard to the USA are publicly concealed or glorified by lies of the world media. Because the criminal perpetrators in politics for their orders and murderous actions as well as for their slander and crimes were never and never will be held accountable, just like the criminal media. So the same crime is repeated by the USA in Syria. The warmongers and their backers of both sexes, as well as their advocates, are always of the same nature, that is to say, totally degenerate morally, possessed of power, dishonest, mendacious and slanderous, self-important, egotistical, arrogant, and depraved in conscience. As far as the negative attitude of the West towards Russia, the Russian people and President Putin is concerned. The main reason for this is cowardly fear. Based on the one hand on the fact that Russia could strike back militarily against the West as a result of Western anti-propaganda against Russia, and on the other hand on the fact that Russia's invasion of the West could replace the incompetent governments with Russian forces and annex the Western states. But that is completely absurd, because Russia, and so also Putin, do not have any such plans because the Russian people, and therefore also Putin, have an effective desire to coexist peacefully with the whole of the West and to maintain genuine peace worldwide. Russia, its entire people and President Putin are in truth peaceful, which is contrary to the West, the USA and the EU dictatorship, as well as unfortunately also to a larger number of completely disinformed anti-Russia and anti-Putin people in Switzerland, which is also due to the false reporting and agitation of the corresponding media, which convey to their readers, listeners, and spectators completely false views and pictures of the Russian president, Russia, and its people.
I can follow and agree with your remarks, because all those degenerate and ruling desk delinquents of the USA, the EU dictatorship, and many other states and their governments, who convert criminal orders, actions and machinations into deeds or have them implemented, as by murderous secret service and military actions, are all degenerate creatures of the worst kind. Basically, they are the real culprits for murderous intelligence and military actions, while those who carry out their orders in complicity are not better, but also degenerate, vicious, degenerate killers, for which there is no excuse. Even the primitive excuse that only orders would be executed can never be an excuse. For every consciously normal person can think for himself and decide whether he wants to carry out an order or not. As a result, if all people, including the military, were to simply refuse in unison and solidarity to carry out warlike, murderous, and destructive orders, wars could never be broken from the fence. And because I had already seen the whole thing this way in my youth, I joined the Légion étrangère in France, in Strasbourg, in order to experience for myself what the military actually is. But when I had experienced enough, I fled, which is why I was persecuted by the henchmen up to the border of Morocco, but escaped happily. Asket wanted to keep me from this whole adventure, but then she agreed because I could make it plausible to her that I had to make the experience necessary for me. So she agreed, but insisted that she would rush to my aid if I called her, which I never did because I wanted to stand on my own 2 feet. The whole adventure was the reason why I refused military service in Switzerland. Well, unfortunately, it is the case that people do not dare to oppose government-like military orders and commands, precisely because they do not have the courage to do so on the one hand, and because they are afraid of punishment on the other. The fact is, however, that they are all equally guilty of giving or carrying out murderous and destructive orders, whether they are the commanders or the perpetrators, for they are all involved in the crimes done to people in many countries. This also applies to the media, which, with their sensational presentations in the sense of the rulers and the supreme military, the secret services and the religions and sects deliberately, profit greedily and irresponsibly help to promote their propaganda for murder, destruction, and delusion. And the media involved are those who are consistently corrupt and dependent on the respective governments, rulers and intelligence services, and who are also involved in all the graffiti of state misinformation, lies, and slander. And it is also these media that defame all free and independent media, and those people who are fact-oriented and knowledgeable about certain political, military, and economic machinations as well as religious and sectarian machinations, and deny their clearly stated effective facts, substantiate them with lies and slander, and insult them as conspiracy theories. And this is what all public and also naive private or organizational media do without exception, which follow the degenerated machinations of those governments, military, religions, and sects on which they are dependent, and which they are corruptly attached to. As a rule, this includes, with only a few exceptions, all large and small media, whose highest leaders submissively follow with those politicians, rulers, military, religions, and sects, etc., because they are dependent on them, incompetent and also too cowardly, but also profit-seeking to stand on their own feet in an upright and honest way. That is why they insult good free journalists, honest and sincere politicians, the military, and all sorts of others who consistently report the truth in free and independent media, as conspiracy theorists, just as they attack their announcements as conjuration or conspiracy and lies. This is a primitive, common, and dirty way of suggestively and compulsively forming the wrong view and opinion among readers, viewers, and listeners that the factual reports of good and clean journalists and other writers working for free and truthful media would only make public conspiracy theories. These state-dependent, corrupt media publish pro-government, lying factual reports, while other so-called free media are undermined and banned if they spread the real truth, as is currently happening particularly blatantly in Turkey, because the autocratic dictator Recep Tayyip Erdogan is preventing anything and everything that brings the truth to light. False reports by governments and the media correspond to an information crime against their readership, who are misled and truthfully deceived. This is particularly true of certain journalists who are not told the truth, who do not care that they are for sale, dishonest, profit-seeking, and sensational. All those responsible for such deliberate misinformation, be it through the media, the corrupt rulers, or their spokespersons, do not care about the truth, nor consequently about the fact that the effective truth does not reach the people. Truly, these responsible persons are completely irresponsible, so bad figures that they should actually run away from their own horrible stench deep into the hottest desert, that neither a human being nor any other living being would have to inhale the stale evaporation. In truth, they do not care about the truth, but only about profit and its power, following it by shrugging their shoulders, drinking champagne and wine, eating caviar and salmon, etc., unscrupulously going over everything that is truthful, awarding themselves prizes for it or letting themselves be awarded prizes for it. When they, the rulers and the media, deliberately mocking the public or the people, present self-invented factual reports and extra-forged and posed factual images. But there are also those journalists of the media who interview some people and then make fun of them with lies and slander, accuse them of wrongdoing, denigrate them, twist their statements beyond recognition, make them ridiculous, and make them look like scapegoats. In this respect, I have had enough experience since my youth and to this day to be able to judge this and to know how everything about lies and slander, as well as about falsehoods, misinterpreted and lying fact reports, is spread simultaneously on all channels of the mainstream media in order to lie and deceive the readership.
Unfortunately, all that we have now said and explained will not be of much use to the majority of mankind on Earth, because only those from this mass will reflect who seek the truth and then follow it, who follow their reason and know how to judge everything impartially and neutrally. All others are very happy and willing to be influenced and guided by the lying media. But now, Edouard, I have to clarify the following in a private way.